Early 2016. You were in seventh grade, naive, impressionable, passionate, absolutely clueless, still experiencing the high of completing your first novel, 50,000 words for National Novel Writing Month, and wrapped up in a group of friends who all want to tell stories. You create a Google Doc. You share it with all of your school friends. It is titled Dragons, Fun Fantasy Free Write. Over the next 2 weeks, you share the premise. Your friends will each create a human character and a dragon. They will be knights on a fantasy island with your own character as their commander. Even then, you were bossy. It is simplistic, silly, wildly fun. Your friends create their characters. With a little prompting, you begin to write. It is terrible. It shapes your life still.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Edmonds. I'm the editor-in-chief of For Page and Screen magazine. I'm here today with Juliana Reidell, author of Dragons from Free Write to Foundation. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
I'm excited to talk with you about this story. So we'll start off pretty basic. I will admit this might be a silly question considering this is a creative nonfiction piece, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Could you tell me a little bit about what inspired you to write this piece?
Sure. So the piece started out as an assignment in my first year of undergrad. We were asked to write like a literacy narrative. So just something reflecting on our experiences with reading and writing. And my mind instantly went to this pretty terrible but very impactful series of stories I wrote throughout middle and high school because I really did see how I'd grown as a writer and just the many ways that it had like permeated my own life. And so I chose to start experimenting with that, and then eventually the piece ended up where it is today.
Nice. Yeah, I feel like lots of people, at least I say that, I mean myself. I feel like people can really relate to kind of having that one thing from when we were younger that we look at it now, we're like, oh God, what is that? But at the same time, still kind of holds such a special place in our hearts for that. Did you reread or revisit the work when you were writing this at all?
I did. I found myself checking different dates as I was going to be like, how long was it between when I created the thing and when I started writing it? Um, and yeah, just skimming through like different sections and being like, oh yeah, that's where I was in my life at that moment. And you know, it was the kind of experience that looking at your old work can be. That mixture of horror and nostalgia. But it was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. I know that feeling well. Now I'm curious. You said you were double checking kind of like dates and the timeline of the story. When you approach creative nonfiction, when you approach the piece that you've written, how close do you stay to like the factual truth, or how much leeway do you give yourself when you're writing?
Yeah, for the creative nonfiction I've written, I have tried really hard to steer as close as possible to the factual truth. Obviously, for this, I changed names, because I use a couple folks' names a lot. Um, and the only previous piece of creative nonfiction that I'd published was about family members who have since passed. And so I felt like there was a little bit more leeway there in terms of whether I was going to use names or not. But these are people who are still with us and, embarking on their lives, and I didn't think just for privacy reasons that I needed to say names. Um, but I think the bigger challenge for me is just narrowing the scope of what I'm writing about, or with this piece especially because there were just so many other things I could have pulled in, and so trying to encompass the loose trajectory and to give enough examples of like how these stories I was working on kind of infiltrated all these different aspects of my life, while not pulling in like, and then this other thing happened with this other friend and that featured somehow, just being like, no, it needs to be within a certain scope. Um, because I think, real life is so much more messy and complicated than any like fictional narrative that's dreamed up. And so knowing how and when to cut can be difficult.
Absolutely. And I think that your choice throughout the story to kind of focus on like you and your core, what seems like your core friend group from the way it's written, I think focusing on that really helps give that foundation, that kind of scope, as you were saying. I think it works really well to have that. Yeah, yeah, of course. Now, do you write a lot of creative nonfiction? Obviously, you write fiction, you write about dragons too, or did at some point. Do you have one that you prefer, or do you kind of play around with both?
I am much more a fiction writer, actually. I've always been a lot more comfortable with speculative fiction, of course, dragons. Um, I didn't really engage in a lot of creative nonfiction until I started at college, and ended up having to take a couple of classes where I'd be required to work with them and got a little bit more exposed to the genre and started understanding some of the nuances of like that specific section of craft. Um, but even, and so I enjoyed the process of kind of learning how to write creative nonfiction. But to this day, it's a lot easier for me to be like, here's a fiction idea, let me write that. I don't, I'm not very good at mining my life for like what to write for creative nonfiction. And so I think it's definitely been more difficult since, finishing with those classes to be like, what should I really need the extra prompting or the nudge if I want to do more creative nonfiction.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm also someone who does not really write creative nonfiction very frequently. I think I've done it once in my entire life. I think it might stay that way, honestly. So I think it's great to kind of branch out and especially take something um, that started like as a classroom assignment and turn it into something more because I know, um, especially I don't know if I'm remembering from your little bio right, you were an English major. Yes.
Yes. An English major and a French major, but English is more relevant here, yes.
Yeah. I know as English majors, we do so much writing for the classroom. When I was an English major, even now, like as a professor, I do so much writing for the classroom. Um, and it's important to kind of know that you can take that out of the classroom as well and kind of pull it into a separate space, a space like this where you can take it beyond. So I guess my question that's tied to that is, what prompted you to do that? What prompted you to look at this piece and say, oh, this could be more than a classroom assignment?
I think the piece itself kept kind of resurfacing or coming back to me as I was looking over some of my old work, as I was starting to think about, sending things out for submission. Um, and as I'd become more aware of, spaces for creative nonfiction and publications that accept creative nonfiction, this piece just kept kind of surfacing in my mind. And I was like, I think it's a story, obviously, that means a lot to me, but I do think there are a lot of writers out there who have something similar, who have the youthful like thing you explored, that is a little bit cringy to look back on, but really still does mean a lot. And so I thought, well, maybe this would be something people would see as relatable, or would connect to in some way. So I thought I'd try sharing it.
I'm so glad that you did because I love this piece. Our magazine only kind of recently started doing creative nonfiction, so I'll be completely honest, I didn't really know what to expect people to submit to us. Um, and it's still kind of it's so varied. We get so much variety in the submissions of creative nonfiction. But I really love this piece for the exact reasons that you were saying. It's so relatable, it's so fun, and it's also, I think for me, and this is just kind of a tangent, but with creative nonfiction or with any kind of writing about writing, it can be kind of difficult to get into because it's like, okay, you're writing, cool. Like most people who read magazines are writers. But the reason why this piece really resonated with us and our editors was because the focus was writing, yes, and the focus was kind of like the impact the stories had, but it was also the impact on a more personal level with friendships and with like interpersonal connections. And I think that element of it was like what really made it stand out for us and like why we loved it so much. So yeah, that's me gushing about your work. I don't know if there's no question there. Um, Actually, I do have a question kind of relates to that. Your real life friends, do they know about this story?
Um, to my knowledge, no one that is alluded to or mentioned in the piece knows about this piece. Um, we have since gone our separate ways. I mean, most of these were people I knew in high school, and I just graduated from college, so we haven't really kept in touch. Um, I think, well, I mean, it was workshopped in a class. So there are people that I am friends with today who know it exists. But yeah, if any of the people that were I was so close to during the process of all these dragon stories has read it or has recognized themselves in it, I have yet to hear about it.
Mhm. I always think it's interesting if people kind of like write and share with the people who are in the stories. I'm like, I don't think I'd have the bravery to do that. Personally, like, I don't think I could, but that makes sense. That makes sense. Kind of just hasn't happened upon it. Um, I did think of another question while you were talking, and oh, okay, slightly different change of gears. When you write about the dragon stories and how they kind of came to be, you mentioned that your friends created characters to kind of work with your character in the story. That's a really, really interesting approach. It kind of reminded me of D&D, honestly, when I first read it, which I always think. I don't personally play, but I have friends who play, and I'm always like, you can make like really compelling stories out of that. But that's a side note. That kind of collaborative take on writing, did you enjoy it at the time, and or would you consider doing it again? Two questions in one.
I really did enjoy it. The whole friend group I was part of at that time, we all did similar things. I remember creating characters for other people's stories too. And it really was such a nice way to blend, the social aspect and the writing aspect. And I think that really influences how I write today. And I really do respond well to having readers that I trust for my work. I think because so much of my early writing was done in such a social setting. We were all reading each other's things. We were all leaving inane comments on each other's things. Um, it is a dangerous thing to do as well, to like create a character for my story. And I increasingly realized that as some of those early friendships began to sort of splinter and disintegrate. Um, because if you are taking the story seriously, you really owe it to yourself to not just like write out someone's character once you're no longer friends with that person. Um, and so that's what I found myself kind of thinking over increasingly is that that collaboration only fully works as long as the chemistry of the friendship stays the same. In middle and high school, these things can change so much. And so yeah, I'd be like, no, I've developed the character beyond the original conception that was created by someone else. And so I'm going to keep developing them. And I did as long as I worked on the stories. But it's definitely I would enjoy further collaborations, but I do think you kind of have to know what you're getting into, and the potential like fallout, depending on how things go.
Definitely, definitely. I've always been very intimidated by any form of collaborative writing, if I'm being completely honest. Um, it just seems I don't know, it's daunting to me. So I think that it's great that you've had such a good experience with it in general, but also kind of to the point where you would consider doing a variation of it again in the future. So that's really great. Mhm.
Yeah, it's definitely tricky. I mean, you've got different writing styles, different even ways of thinking about writing, and different egos and so forth bumping up against each other. And so I think it's really important to find someone that you work really well with. Um, And that wouldn't even necessarily hypothetically have to be like your best friend or something, because I think it's entirely possible to be great friends and terrible like collaborators. Um, but I think knowing someone's style and knowing how you'd work with them is just so important, like going forward for anything like that.
Absolutely. And speaking of style and approach and all of that, could you tell me a little bit about your writing process? How do you go from idea to final product?
Oh gosh. I mean, that really depends. I've had ideas that I've just like put aside and mulled over for years and years. I've had things that a lot of the time I write in like spurts, especially for shorter pieces, which I honestly usually find trickier than longer form. I'm not a very concise person. Um, so I'll write a few pages, think it's the worst thing I've ever written, put it aside for potentially months, stumble across it again, be like, oh, that's kind of good. And then I'll do another spurt. And finally, I'll have the momentum to finish it. Um, the first draft, I will revise until I can't think of what else to do, or I can't like do it inside my head anymore, and I really do objectively need outside feedback. And then it will go to, it's been different professors at college, it's been, writing buddies, um, and then I can decide what I want to do with that feedback and like whether I want to invest, how much time I want to invest in the piece. Because I always have other ideas going on as well. So,
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. With kind of the after you're done your round of editing, looking for new opinions, you mentioned professors, you mentioned writing buddies. Do you have kind of a core group of people that you go to, especially now that you've graduated outside of like the classroom setting?
I do. I have a group of friends. They're not all in the same group. I have a workshop group for a novel project with two other people who are also wonderful writers, and a couple of other friends who I've shared things with in the past. Some of which I've worked with in like in class workshop settings. Whose opinions and eyes I really trust at this point. And so that's normally who it would go to at this. Yeah, having graduated now, that's who it would go to.
Makes sense. Yeah, I know for a lot of people it can be really hard to kind of find that community. So it's great that you have that. 'Cause especially people who kind of haven't gone through formal education or haven't taken writing classes, kind of like, where do we start? Um, and that can be hard. So it's great to have that kind of support system and that network. Um,
Yeah. No, I'm really grateful. I've always really kind of needed that community to hold me accountable if nothing else. Um and I'm always looking for more talented writer friends out there, but I really am glad to have found a few people that I can share with at this point.
And that's awesome. I know there are a lot of different like online writing communities as well. Just kind of like shout out to anyone listening who is looking for a community. There are definitely online writing groups that can be really, really helpful with that too. Um, yeah. Anyway, it always feels weird kind of changing gears of the question. It's like, cool, moving on. Um, but I'm curious, could you tell me a little bit about how you got into writing in the first place? I mean, we have kind of this story within a story, but what made you want to be a writer?
Oh gosh, I've always been such a big reader. I was a pretty early reader, and I write poetry from time to time as well, but increasingly, I've started realizing I'm just drawn to storytelling as a whole. And so whether that is usually it's fiction, sometimes creative nonfiction. I enjoy poetry, but for me, poetry is more about the language and the use of language and form. And I really am just compelled by stories. And so however I can be making up a story is great. Um, I have a few pages still of, I think I was in second or third grade, and I started writing. It was a very similar thing. Like it was me and my friends going on an adventure or whatever. Um, and my teacher jokingly started calling it the Great American Novel. And so very early on, there's been this interest in like, oh, I can make things too, and always based on the books I'm reading of like, I want to be able to write like so and so does. I want to be able to create stories that make other people feel the way these books I'm reading have made me feel. Um, so I don't know if that's like writing for your inner child or what, but um, so I'd always wanted to write for a long time. I'm a very slow hand writer, and so once I got to a point where I was like, "Oh, you can do this on a computer," um, that was when things really took off. And so that was I started just based on what I was doing at school in particular. I started doing a lot more online in about seventh grade, and so that was when the dragon stuff started and when I really started engaging more seriously with like I want to be a writer.
Definitely. And you mentioned kind of like wanting to write, like, oh, I want to make people feel the way this book made me feel. Do you have any specific authors that you consider kind of inspirations in that way?
Yeah, definitely. In terms of what I was reading at the time, and I still dearly treasure these, Tui Sutherland's Wings of Fire series, of course, The Dragons and Hilarity. They're just wonderful books. And one day maybe I'll write a piece about just those books and how they've shaped my life. But um, that's middle grade. Sticking with the dragon theme, I believe it's Rachel Hartman who wrote Serafina, which is a more YA dragon-based story. Also a really fascinating take on like the kind of dragon-human relationships. Um, these days, I read a lot of alternate history. I've been reading a lot of P. J. Clark. I just actually wrote my English literature thesis on one of his novellas, and I just love everything he does. And I've just started getting into N.K. Jemisin, her Great Cities trilogy. I'm not usually much of a like not magical realism, like contemporary fantasy set in the real world, but fantastical kind of thing. Um, but I've just been loving what I've been reading so far. So I'm looking forward to diving more into her work.
I love that. I'll have to check out some of those titles because I've heard of some, I've not heard of all. So I'll definitely have to check those out. Um, Now, do you think you'll ever revisit the dragons stories and kind of revamp them, so to speak?
There are aspects of them and of the world I started developing later on in high school as I was sort of revamping the world that I do still like and that I would like to play with. A few of the concepts I've kind of like cut and pasted into other things that I've written at this point. I don't know that I'd ever. I think it would be more of that process of like, I want to take this character and save this character. Because the original thing didn't have much of a plot, and there are, a lot of the early characters, especially the ones that were created by other people, after a certain point, it feels odd to play with them too much. Um, but I think. There definitely were things I stumbled across along the way that I'm like, I do still like that, and I would like to see an iteration of that in something I write, including some of the dragons themselves.
Totally, totally. Now in the kind of like new writing that you're working on, the new fiction writing, what kind of, or are there any themes that you find yourself kind of returning to, any motifs, anything that you just really love working into your stories?
Um, well, I think what most of the people who've had to read my recent stuff would say is there's a lot of French names. I had a French major as well at school and became a bit of a Francophile, not an uncritical Francophile, because you can only read so much about French colonialism and be uncritical. But um, I've been doing. I've been working on this project of also alternate history, and so there's a lot of been a lot of um, French influence. It's sort of the like early colonial period, and I think I've put in far more French influence than there should be, but I just love French names. They're so pretty. Um, so that's been a thing. I think in terms of deeper themes, connection overall, and that's in fiction and creative nonfiction and poetry, how people see themselves in the world and how they try to form bonds despite, you know, differing levels of success. Language as a whole is interesting to me, although that gets explored more often in poetry, usually the connection between language and family and like ancestry and stuff like that. Um, and in terms of like magic concepts, I guess, because I do love speculative fiction so much, um, I've written a lot of fiction and poetry at this point with themes of, I guess, what I call the intangible. So being able to hold something like a dream or a shadow in your hand and what that might look like and what that kind of might do to a person to have those kind of abilities. Um, that's been my little speculative fiction conceit recently. And we'll see if I move out of that phase eventually, but I'm enjoying it for now.
That's all that matters is just to have fun with it while you're doing it. So I have two questions. I'm going to try to remember both. But the first question, you mentioned kind of writing alternative history. How, that's, I've never done it. Sounds difficult to me. How do you go about kind of balancing the historical and the fictional in that?
Well, I definitely haven't found like a perfect formula at this point. It does make me very nervous. Because I really do. I mean, for a first draft, just get it out there, get it done. Um, but there comes a certain point where I am like, I need to get the details right. And it's definitely possible to go really far down historic rabbit holes and um, I blame my parents. They're both historians, and so I don't think I would, even in purely speculative fiction, I don't think I would incorporate so much, historic kind of callbacks or historic settings or anything like that without their influence. Um, so I think, I mean, and it's difficult too because you want to. Depending on what the speculative element is, the speculative element, I don't think should necessarily correct past injustices, anything like that. I think I've read some really great works where the speculative element is usually created or is used to enhance the power or the living experience of people who were oppressed and in some cases still face a lot of oppression today. Um, and that I think is really interesting, but I don't think it's necessarily, especially, I mean, as a white writer, a white female cisgender writer, like I don't want to erase anyone's experiences of trauma or marginalization. That doesn't feel like it's my place. And so it definitely, I think, requires a lot of kind of careful thinking and self-searching to be like, what is an appropriate use of these speculative elements in a story like this? Like what is it my place to say and write, and what is a story that I think someone else could write better than I could?
Absolutely. And always love hearing authors kind of take that into consideration because I know, especially in speculative fiction, like 15, 20 years ago, that was not something that was taken into consideration at all. Um, yeah, so I agree completely, and I love hearing that. Um, I think that it's a really hard balance to strike, like you were saying, and taking that time and consideration is like a huge kind of like starting point to reaching that balance and reaching that consideration and making a story in the most kind of responsible and respectful way possible. So yeah, no question there. That's just great.
Sensitivity readers and knowing that mistakes will be made, I think that, but at least trying to engage with that concept of, what can I do to like to be a good author in terms of telling a good story, but in terms of, you know, portraying characters accurately and fairly and respectfully. And what does that mean in terms of what stories I want to be telling?
Absolutely. It's great to kind of take all of those steps. I think that's fantastic. Um, Completely different train of thought because I'm determined to remember that second question. Um, so you've mentioned a couple times writing poetry, and specifically you mentioned writing speculative poetry, which is something that I think is fascinating. How do you kind of go about incorporating genre elements like that into poetry?
Um, I mean, it really depends. I think a lot of mine, it's either I've written a few poems, they're sonnets because these things come to me better in like fixed form sometimes. Um, where it's the character themselves that is engaging in something speculative or is a little unusual in their own way, a little uncanny perhaps. Um, and I think that works really well because sonnets are so short. You've only got 14 lines and you can evoke things and you can create these images, but you don't have to explain them too much. It's about the impact of the unusual imagery or the theme you're drawing towards. It doesn't have to be like a full novel explaining what's going on with this character. And I like full-length novels. It's usually a challenge for me to keep something so short and concise, but it can definitely be more powerful when it is just that quick little punch. Um, a lot of the time, I think it is imagery. Whether it's plants growing out of a human body or something like that, that seems blatantly speculative, but usually it's getting at like a deeper theme. The speculative nature, it's not meant to be, you know, a hard sci-fi novel where you really need to explain how these things are happening. It's just a vehicle for something else that's going on in the poem, whether that's talking about, arrogance or identity or whatever.
That makes sense. That definitely makes sense. And I love the idea of doing that in the shorter form poems. I'm a huge fan of like short poems, personally, and it can be really challenging, especially when you're dealing with larger concepts like that, speculative or not, to kind of keep them condensed. So that's a really great challenge kind of to take on. How do you kind of go about editing down and keeping things concise? Like, do you have a specific, not rule, but like a specific pattern, habit that you use for that?
I don't as of yet, but that's a very appropriate question. I had this past semester, my last semester, I was writing my senior capstone for creative writing, and the first draft ended up being twice what it needed to be in the final version, twice the length. Um, and so that was really like I'd always known I had a problem with being concise, but that was really my wake-up call to be like, you are doing too much. Like you really need to be learning some techniques for how to get your pieces shorter or how to cut, but ideally also how to start with a smaller scope so that you don't necessarily have to spend half the semester frantically cutting down your manuscript. Um, and I mean, I'm glad I had to go through that process. I think it turned out a sharper piece because of it. But um, I think, if for folks who are the type of writers who plan a lot of things out in advance, I'm very much not, which also makes it more difficult, I think. When it comes to that, oh, I need to make it look prettier now stage. Um, if you plan things out in advance, knowing like how many scenes you're going to have, stuff like that, gives a decent idea of what the page length will be and what the scope will be. Um, I think a lot of the time it comes down to really having to think about the essential themes and the essential character beats in a narrative. And like, how can I get that same message across in as few scenes as possible, or, in as few flashbacks or whatever it's going to take. And it's always the kill your darlings thing. It's painful. I'm always like, no, my baby. But it is sometimes it needs to be done, and sometimes it really is a better product afterwards. So I think just being very purposeful and engaging as deeply as possible with the material to really figure out what is the story I'm trying to tell. Usually that's the first step in terms of how can I get it into the shape I want it.
Yeah, no, I definitely get that. It can be very, very painful at times to do that. But yeah, it's a great practice to have to kind of be open and not heartbroken over every single little thing. Takes a while to learn that sometimes, but um, I don't think it ever really goes away, if I'm being completely honest. It just gets easier sometimes. Sometimes, I guess. I hope. Um, yeah, so do you have any kind of upcoming publications or anything that you're working on that you'd like to talk about that you'd like our listeners to go read once it's out? Anything like that?
I don't have anything at this moment. I've been sending things out on submission, but it's just the waiting game at this point. Um, I think if there's anything I'd want to kind of pitch, um, the university that I went to, Arcadia University, um, and we have an undergraduate lit mag. I was co-editor in chief, and so everyone should go look at Quiddity. Um, we do like a name blind submission process. So I do have I've had a few pieces in there in the past. If anyone wanted to find my work specifically in there. Um, and I actually have one. I know this is for creative writing, but I have a scholarly publication out there as well, in an undergraduate research journal. It's called Eureka, Ureca. Undergraduate, I'm gonna forget the acronym at this point. But for because you mentioned alternate history, it's on a couple of notable female fighters in the Haitian Revolution, um, which is an area of study that I'm interested in just overall. And so that is a thing available for people to read if anyone really wanted to go dive down the scholarly rabbit hole there.
I always support scholarly rabbit holes. I think they're fantastic. But definitely, definitely. Now, so spoiler alert for our listeners, I also teach at Arcadia University. So we have this kind of like link. I've never met you on campus. We have never had classes together. But I remember seeing in your bio, I'm like, hey, that's fun. Um, but I always feel bad because my students will ask me about quiddity and I know next to nothing about it. So I know I'm terrible. But I'm curious, could you tell me a little bit about what kind of the editorial process for quiddity looks like? Just because I'm curious, I don't know how that works for you.
No, it's generally pretty low pressure, although we do have some spirited discussions from time to time. Um, we usually run two contests per semester, and that will have like a specific theme, whether that's like writing a specific form, or we'll just give you a prompt, whether that's like a quote or a date or something, and then we just won't work that response to it. And those get published on the site, and then we have the general issue, which is open to all different kinds of submissions, including artwork, and that doesn't have any specific theme. And so the staff will meet usually a couple of times, depending on the amount of submissions we receive, and just go through. It's usually kind of like a reading rank system, but then we talk through each piece, and there have been usually mild arguments over, what we want to include. And generally, because we don't have a specific theme for the issue, we are willing to publish a pretty eclectic mix of things. Though on occasion we'll think, oh, this is too thematically similar or whatever, but it goes to a vote. So there have been times where, I've been outvoted on something I thought either should stay in or shouldn't. Um, but I mean, it's a really supportive community, I think. And I definitely encourage anyone, any undergrad at Arcadia to go submit.
Definitely, definitely. I also encourage that. And if you're not an undergrad at Arcadia, you can still submit to Arcadia's graduate literary magazine, which is Marathon Literary Review, I think. I think that's what it's called. I worked for it when I was a student at Arcadia. Um, I don't know how long ago, but a while ago, grad student. So that was fun. But anyway, back to questions. Do you think that your experience working on the editorial side influenced the way you write at all?
I think it definitely made me more aware of how to interpret the rejections I was getting from other publications. Um, I think I've been a bit nicer to myself now that I've been on the other side. Um, because I think there are ways that, especially for Quiddity, because we did a, name blind process, there were times we'd be talking about a piece and the writer would be in the room, the writer would be on staff. Because it's such a small university too. Um, it made sense to welcome their submissions, but I think that definitely put me in mind. It definitely made me a better critiquer. um I definitely was able to formulate a little bit more how to give very specific comments and usually how to phrase them in a more constructive way. um you know which is still frustrating to me when I get rejections that will be like, it wasn't for us, and I'm like, what does that mean? So anyone that gives me like specific feedback with a rejection, absolutely love that. Deeply appreciate that. But most lit mags out there are a lot bigger than our little, little university publication. And so I understand that not everyone has the time to do that. And so, at the bare minimum, being polite is nice. Um, but in terms of like how I actually write, I don't necessarily think so, because I think for me it's always been important to write without thinking of like, oh, maybe I'll send this out somewhere. Um, I think that kind of stymies the creative process a little bit if all you're thinking about is trying to have that end result. Um, and being able to just play around with the piece itself and hopefully enjoy the writing of it. For me, it's usually I enjoy the drafting and I get through the revising. Um, and then once it's done, to be like, well, is there a place that I think this might fit with? Um, because it's a task if it's just I need to get this piece out there, whereas I think it can be more joyful if it's more process oriented.
That makes a lot of sense for sure. Once you do kind of hit that point where you're sending out pieces to magazine, do you have a kind of specific method for finding magazines, or do you just kind of like, oh, it fits the word count, it goes there, which is admittedly what I do. But I know some people have methods, so I'm curious how you go about that.
Kill Subs is always really nice, as like a collection of different magazines out there. I have definitely seen things there where, or like on their Instagram where they'll say like, here's 15 mags that are open for submission, and I'll go and look at those. Um, I think within, especially with speculative, there's a few kind of like big names that I wistfully keep my eye on their submission, open submission periods. I made my own little list of just like, these are intriguing and I want to keep my eye on them more. Like if I think kind of their vibe or whatever matches what my writing looks like, or they don't feel too intimidating or anything. Um, I do, I always try to read a few pieces from a magazine before submitting to it, just because I don't want to be that person that sends them something totally, out of left field, and obviously didn't. Um, and it depends. I do more submitting over the summer for what's open because I didn't have time during the semester, kind of thing. But you never know. It's a little sporadic. Sometimes I'll just come across something and be like, why not? So,
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. I definitely do recommend people read submissions, even though I tend to not do that. I'm terrible. I am the type of person who would just send whatever anywhere. But no, no, that definitely makes sense. And there are so many different literary magazines out there that it can be really kind of daunting to go through them so methodically. It's kind of a whole separate job just submitting places. hmm But yeah, no, that makes sense. Usually when we get kind of closer to the end of the interview, I like to ask people, is there anything that you want to talk about specifically that we have not talked about? So I think we've reached that point. We can talk about anything you like.
Gosh. Um, well, okay, this is maybe an odd request, but I got the flu a couple days after issue 7 came out, so I was reading the pieces, but I have very little memory of them. So could you give like a little elevator pitch for the issue and why people should read absolutely everything in it?
I can. Let me pull it up. So I'm not misrepresenting it. Um, because this round of interviews, I've been talking to people from issues 6 and 7. So I'm like, I have both stories in my head or both issues in my head.
I'm sure is very readable as well.
Yes, yes, they're both great. Um, but yeah, I think with this issue, um, I'm kind of just like looking through it. I'm like, we have lots of inanimate objects in the titles. We have ice houses and Roomba vacuums and churches and couches and chairs and plums. Just scrolling through the titles. So if you're interested in inanimate objects, no. Um, this issue specifically really has a lot to do with people's expectations kind of for themselves and for their lives and what happens when those are not met or when they kind of betray who they think they are. Um, like I said, I didn't believe I said this earlier, or I thought it. I don't think I said it. Um, our issues, we go through a very similar selection process. We vote on every story, so it can be very kind of eclectic. I tend to prefer speculative and genre pieces. Some of our other editors prefer more literary, real kind of realism. So we get a bit of both every time. So finding a common thread is always really interesting. And we do try to do that. We do try to kind of find those threads for our little blurb that we put at the beginning of every issue. And for when we get the cover art, we're like, what works here? And I think for this issue, our cover art kind of really embodies that because it's a taxidermy bat and a bat skeleton. And that seems really random, but it's kind of you have this taxidermy bat, which is large and spread out and takes up half the image, and the bat skeleton is like not even half the size. It's so much smaller, but it carries the weight of that larger being. So just kind of like the disconnect between what appears, so how someone appears to be, how someone presents, and how they actually are, how their life actually is. So if you're interested in that, you should read issue 7.
Sounds great.
Yes, yes, I love issue 7. It's a fun one. I think they're all fun though, so I'm extremely biased. But yeah, absolutely. Um, and I, sorry, sometimes with issues like we do things that are a little silly. Like this one, we had one story in this issue called The End. It's our final piece. And I'm like, I don't care what it does in the lineup. It has to be the final piece because it would feel terrible to start at the end. But no. But anyway, yes, if our listeners are reading issue 7, definitely check out Dragons from Free Write to Foundation. It's a great time. Yeah, so I think I only have one question left. So are we good to move on to that?
Yeah, yeah.
Perfect. I asked this question of everyone. It's a little cheesy. But if you could give one piece of writing advice to other writers out there, what would it be?
Sure. Well, gosh, I am young. I am still in need of that advice. I feel so official being asked that question. Um, but I think one thing that really threw me for a loop a lot throughout my teenage years was the idea that there was like a right way, kind of a pun, but a right way to write. Um, I would read these books about like how to create a plot and how to create characters and and read what different authors whose work I was reading did. And if I wasn't doing exactly that, that I had a lot of the like imposter syndrome of like I'm doing it wrong. Like I'm never gonna get out there because I don't do exactly what so and so does. Um, and that is not the case. Um, it really, really is just about finding what works for you. And that doesn't even have to be like, I found it and I will use this for the rest of my life. Um, I have sort of a process that's pretty consistent at this point, but I'm always, interested in trying new things. You know, actually writing down ideas every once in a while would probably help me a bit. Um, Keeping track of like different plot points in a story would be great. Um, so there's no one right way to do it. And so don't feel invalidated if your writing process differs from someone else's, even if that someone else has like 15 published books out there. Maybe you will too one day. And even if you don't, as long as writing is still bringing you joy, I think it's still worthwhile and it's still important.
Absolutely. That's fantastic advice. Thank you so much for that advice and for being here and speaking with me today. It's been really, really great getting to talk with you.
Yes, thank you so much. It's been a great time. Thanks for having me here for the interview.